All right, to close out the day, we have one final collection of speakers, beginning with Dr. Paul Yock, who's on the faculty here at Stanford, and who has really spent a career inventing, designing, and testing new devices for cardiovascular care, for intravascular ultrasound imaging, the smart needle.
You're doing well.
Yes, thank you. And many, many other things. An incredibly impressive individual who is joined by members of, or products of the Biodesign program, which is founded by Dr. Yock, and he is the director of that program. I'm going to get off this. I'm sort of getting out of the way here.
Okay, sounds good.
And he will introduce his two Biodesign experts here after he introduces the Biodesign program and some of the innovations that are happening. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. So we are very much aware that this is the last slot. Our deep responsibility is keep everybody awake for the next half hour. And what we want to do is, I'm going to start by just talking about a process that we use for trying to develop new technologies. And then we're going to have a couple of examples of new technologies in the perinatal care space. So James Wall is a surgeon with us, assistant professor here, was a Biodesign fellow, and Mark Juravic took a class. Both of them have developed technologies in this space that they're going to tell you about. So the basic thing that we try to do with the Biodesign process that we teach, a little drama to wait.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good. That's great.
Sorry.
we try to flip the discovery process on its head. So there is a tremendous virtue in what we mostly do in the university, which is to invent new technologies, come up with new discoveries, and then see how they're applied, find a clinical application for that. We go in the reverse. We start with needs finding to concentrate first on identifying an important need and then invent a technology for that. Now, that's what I'd like to tell you about. We start out the process with this segment that we call identify, and we have a mantra, which is that a well-characterized need is the DNA of a great invention. Let me tell you quickly how this works, and then we'll get into the examples. So we assemble teams up front of engineers and physicians. We have them go live in the hospital, and they spend a couple of months in an area of medicine. When they come to us, they don't know which area they're starting out in. We say, okay, this year is neurology and neurosurgery. Go pester the neurologists and the neurosurgeons and the nurses and find out what they really need. And we ask them to come up with at least 200 of those needs before they come back into the program. That turns out to be very easy to do. What's difficult is to understand which of those needs really are important to take forward. And so we do a need screening process. We overpopulate. They're primed with lots of needs. And then we filter them down. We filter them down with a set of filters that are relatively easy to do quickly. What's the real clinical impact? Is it important? Who are the stakeholders involved? And is there a stakeholder who might block an invention in this area? So FDA is a candidate that if there's a tough pathway. Sometimes physician groups are potential negative stakeholders. What are the evolving treatment options? And then a rough back of the envelope calculation of what's the market opportunity. And this is the cold, hard reality, and it's especially relevant for our group here, that unless you have some kind of a business pathway, a potential pathway, unless there's enough of a driver, it actually is not worth pursuing that need. If you can't get it to patient care, you shouldn't start the journey. That's the hard reality. We have a mechanism, and these guys will show you, we create a one-sentence mission statement of what that need is, again, before any inventing, and then we develop a specification for the ideal need. And this Takes many weeks to do this right, but at the end of this, if you have a good need statement and a good need specification, you understand that need really, really well. And actually, the inventing process is pretty straightforward after that. So the next step, finally, and this is like 4 months into our process, now it's time for inventing. And I love what this group said: given enough time, sugar, and caffeine, you will come up with an invention. This is our deep belief that once you get the need right, the inventing part is actually pretty straightforward. We use a standard design methodology. We invent several solutions for each need. And then we screen again, and this time we bring in the hard screens. Intellectual property. Is there, patents? Are there patents out there that may be problematic? What's the regulatory pathway? What's the reimbursement model? Is there existing reimbursement for this in the system, or does that have to be created? And then what is the basic business model for taking it forward? Process works well just from the fellows and students in the university. We've just had our 41st technology startup as a company. These span all kinds of different clinical applications. The thing we're more proud of is the number of patients reached. So these are first-time innovators. And these companies are pretty young still, but we're at 500,000, actually on the way to over 600,000 patients, and that number is increasing rapidly. So the process seems to be reproducible. So with that, let me introduce Mark Juravic, who was a student in our class, and he's going to tell you a little bit about a needs area and a technology that he and his team have developed and are bringing forward by means of a company called Maternal.
Thank you, Dr. Yock. So at Maternal, we're developing a device to try to prevent some of the damage that women commonly suffer during childbirth. So when you think about damage that results from childbirth, most people think about tearing. And the reason is 80% of women suffer some degree of laceration as a result of vaginal delivery. Most of these lacerations occur in a region called the perineum, which is the region between the vagina and the rectum. And they are graded in severity from 1 through 4. So the greater the severity, the greater the consequences that arise from these tears. And so our original need statement was to try to find a way to prevent or reduce the incidence of these vaginal lacerations. But as we were investigating this need, we learned that there are a lot of things that obstetricians worry about during vaginal delivery. And preventing tears is something they cared about, but it wasn't high on the list. And we realized that developing a device only to reduce lacerations was perhaps unfundable or very difficult to fund. And we received the feedback that, if you could somehow find an angle that talked about sort of the long-term implications of vaginal delivery, maybe that's an area that would be more fundable. There's always been this link between women that deliver vaginally and future pelvic floor disorders, things like incontinence and prolapse. And for a long time, we never knew exactly why. And about 15 years ago, researchers started imaging patients that came in with these pelvic floor disorders. And a large percentage of them seemed to have this defect in their pelvic muscles. One of their pelvic muscles seemed to be missing. And they hypothesized, well, this is probably something that happened during childbirth, and they started imaging patients before and after childbirth, and indeed they found out that greater than 30% of the time women are having an injury to this pelvic muscle that is now being linked to these problems later in life. And so we sort of redefined our need into not only trying to prevent lacerations during delivery, but can we prevent this pelvic muscle injury, which could then have long-term implications to mother. And these problems are sort of a lot bigger problem than most people think. 11% of all women in this country will have surgery at some point in their life because of a pelvic floor disorder, and half of all women suffer symptoms by the time they turn 55, and damage resulting from childbirth is the main indicating factor of why. So why is this damage occurring? And we think it's perhaps a case of too much stretch happening too quickly. So we sort of judge the progress of labor on the sort of dilation of the cervix. And sort of the average patient spends about 14 hours during the first phase of labor. And what's happening during that time is the baby's been living in the uterus and it starts contracting the baby's head down toward the cervix. And it takes about 14 hours for the baby's head to slowly open up the cervix. But the tissue that surrounds the vaginal canal where these pelvic muscles lie don't really dilate until the baby's actually coming through, in which case they go from 0 to baby, and that happens rather quickly. And so the concept is, what if we could take advantage of some of that time that a woman is spending during the first phase of labor and slowly prepare the pelvic muscles and vaginal canal for this delivery, remove the device, and when the baby comes through, hopefully it doesn't do the same damage. So we sort of got this idea anecdotally from obstetricians and midwives claim that whenever there was a precipitous delivery, so a quick delivery, there seemed to be more tearing. Obstetricians also, on occasion, have held the baby's head back to give the tissue a little bit more time to stretch, or the midwives often practice technique where they don't have the mother push, again, to give the tissue a little bit extra time to stretch. So what we've developed is a mechanical dilator that would be used during the first phase of labor for about 30 to 90 minutes. You could see sort of where it's placed. The target is sort of the first half of the vaginal canal. That's where the pelvic muscles are injured. And you would remove the device, and the sort of benefit of that stretching would last for several hours after. So it's not like you need to do the dilation, remove the device, and have the baby come immediately after. We believe that there's several hours of benefit from the device after. We have some animal studies that show greater than 4 hours. And there's actually one publication that proposed doing sort of what we're proposing to do. There's a researcher in South Africa that was concerned with obstructed deliveries, so babies getting stuck on the way out. And what he did is he started a study with 30 patients, half in the device and half in the control group, where he dilated their vaginal canals with an IV bag, and he glued a pessary to the front of it because he thought that would help hold it in place. And in that small study, he showed that there was a significant decrease in the length of the second phase of labor and a decrease in the use of instrument deliveries. And so we think that there could be many value propositions to doing this preparatory dilation, preventing tears, preventing pelvic muscle injury, and perhaps you could have an easier, quicker delivery. So we've been using our device clinically now at a couple sites. One is at El Camino Hospital here in Mountain View, and the other, our primary clinical site, is in Houston with the Baylor Obstetrics Group. Our target is enrolling 30 patients, and we're at patient 28 so far. And to date, the results have been very encouraging. We've followed up 20 patients at 3 months post-delivery with the pelvic muscle ultrasound, and so far we have yet to see a pelvic muscle injury in those patients. And as I mentioned, the injury rate is reported in the literature as greater than 30%. So now we are enrolling control patients to give us something else to control to. We seem to have a reduction in laceration rate as well. It's not 0, and so it's not as impressive as our pelvic muscle injury rate just yet. So those are the endpoints that we're looking at: pelvic muscle damage, laceration rate, and length of delivery is a little bit trickier to assess. When the mother started pushing, and who's got the stopwatch ready, and so that's probably something that'll take some time to understand. So this is something else that many of you probably know, that childbirth is the #1 reason for hospitalization in the world. So we think that if we develop a technique, a device that has all the benefits that we hope it does, that this could become standard of care, which makes this a very viable business as well. Along this development path, though, we've learned that obstetrics is an area that is not commonly funded by venture capitalists. And as we start to develop the company and move towards sales and marketing, we might have to look for sort of alternative sources of funding. And so we've had this idea of another secondary market with a very similar technology to treat patients that suffer from pelvic pain. This device would replace vaginal dilators that are used for patients predominantly with vaginismus and a number of other conditions. But this market is a direct-to-consumer market with a Class 2 exempt regulatory pathway, so we could launch this device actually before we would even launch the birth device, and hopefully proceeds for this could help fund the birth program as well. Thank you.
So I think let's hold questions. Remember your questions, okay? And we'll hold them until the end. And James, fire away.
Sure, will do. Okay, this is it. The last 10 minutes of the day. Thank you all for the opportunity, and thanks, Paul, for the opportunity. I think if there's sort of two things I want to convey with this quick talk, it's number one, the process that Paul talked about, and frankly, kind of came up with, and has really been inspired to share at Stanford. When applied, it works, and it can be applied by students, and they can have success, and they can get something almost to the market, which I'm going to show you here. So that's sort of lesson number one. It's a good process, and at all levels it can be used. And then, number two, with pediatric devices, as we talked about, small market, there are some issues around business, development and whatnot that everyone's aware of. You can do a lot of work within the university when you have good resources and good people and some level of funding. And I want to specifically speak to the Coulter Foundation, which has funded this program. So Life Bubble, all of the biodesign projects start with a clinical observation. This was the one. So adult central lines, big issues around line infections. It's a reportable event. All kinds of devices that secure and protect central lines in adults. And they work pretty well. And between protocols, hand washing, and these devices, the rate of central line infections in adults is less than 1%. In our most vulnerable premature babies, we use a chunk of non-sterile tape. I probably observed this, as a pediatric surgeon 10 times a day for, my entire career. It never really struck me, but a group of graduate students who went in and saw it said, this is crazy, right? A piece of non-sterile tape is holding a central line. Now, there's a reason for it, right? You can't completely cover that. There's a design challenge here, right? You've got a dying piece of tissue, which is the umbilical stalk, and you can't just totally cover it. So you can't use the adult stuff, but you probably can do better than a piece of tape. So they were audacious enough to think they can do better. The need that they came up with was a way to protect umbilical catheters in neonates in order to decrease central line-associated bloodstream infections. Is it a problem? We always kind of challenge the design teams to make sure that it's something worth working on. About 200,000 catheters placed in the US, about 10,000 bloodstream infections. Obviously, those are not all catheter related, but there certainly is a relationship. And about 1,000 unnecessary deaths from bloodstream infections. So, problem worth working on. It's not the billion-dollar market of bariatric surgery, but it's important. What's even more important when you look at it is that hospitals have to pay for these infections now, or at least they don't get reimbursed for it. So, it costs about $20K to treat bloodstream infection, and hospitals eat that cost now because it's a never event. Not only that, they have to report it on their websites, and that's not something people like to talk about. So when you put all that together, it comes down to about a $1,000 cost per line placed because you don't know which one's going to get infected. And that's an area where you probably can develop something because there's opportunity. This is what the team came up with. Pretty simple device. This is the most recent prototype. It's made to protect the umbilical stump and catheter interface. It standardizes the process as opposed to the arts and crafts of building the so-called tape bridge. And it really simplifies the procedure and saves time. It can be done much faster than the arts and crafts. Couple key components to it in the early design was that there's stabilization clips on the two sides that kind of fit into the current workflow. We'll get to that in a minute. It's really based on user feedback. There's a skin barrier that prevents translation of bacteria from the skin, which may be one of the causes. And then there's a vented dome that protects from inadvertent inoculation and touching of the catheter, but it also allows the natural desiccation. And that was the real design challenge. You can't cover the cord, but you can protect it a lot better. What's the team done within Stanford? They've done fundamental biologic testing. Big question that first came to us was how much venting do you need? Does it need to be a little slit, big slit, et cetera? So they've set up a test bed just over in the next building over here in Shriram and figured out what level of venting is necessary. They then took silicone and different materials and made sure they weren't going to make things worse. Ultimately, they were able to show that with a silicone, well-vented system, you can decrease infection rates in kind of real use with our device. Engineering testing, looking at where the old system fails, making sure our system's better, pretty straightforward. It turns out the old system failed at less than 1 pound of force, so it wasn't really that great at stabilization anyway. And then this is the big one, and this is one that I think a lot of people, when they come up with something, don't really go to this early on. But when you're talking about an item that's going to be used by nurses, it's a little bit of a preference item. I mean, I made the value proposition for you on cost of infections, and we can prove all that with a clinical trial, but someone still has to pull it off the shelf and use it. So Lauren Wood, who's over here, one of our medical students, with the help of some design mentors, has gone in with the NICU nurses and gone through and figured out what's important to them, what are their feelings about this device. And it turns out that the feeling of securement is super important, that they don't trust anything else to touch the baby, so don't even try and make your own adhesive, use what we've already got. And these seem minor, but these are really important insights, and it took her going in, working with them, and figuring that out. So we're still in that process. We're iterating based on that. But I think you can't underestimate the importance of early user interface, feedback, preference studies, etc. Where is it going? We think ultimately, if we can come to a design that works, certainly some clinical evidence would be great. It's a Class 1 exempt regulatory pathway, which is really straightforward. We can make this thing for hopefully less than $5 as a silicone mold at scale, and hopefully integrate it into a kit. And I think it would be attractive to be combined with a catheter, so you kind of have an all-in-one, put the catheter in, use the bubble to protect it. This is kind of the translational project objectives, a little bit boring, but we've made a fair amount of progress. This has all been done within Stanford and remains here for now. Academic preparations, we've already manufactured prototype devices. We're able to make them pretty much at scale at this point. We're planning for the clinical trial and an application to the FDA for our Class 1 exemptions not too far away. It'll translate out of the university at some point, because we're not going to be selling devices from within here, but that's kind of the pathway. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and hope you guys all had a good day.
Let me show you 2 minutes worth of one other quick example, and that is from a global needs finding expedition that a couple of our fellows who worked in New Delhi came across. So their problem was neonatal resuscitation. Their need statement at the bottom was a way for frontline health workers to be able to bag infants. So if you think about it, 70% of the deliveries in India are not in hospital settings, although the workers, the assistants that help with the deliveries are reasonably sophisticated people. They have trouble bagging the babies, and this was a problem that Ayesha and Avijit observed time and time again as they did their needs finding in India. Again, the problem was, identifying the problem was key. The solution was pretty straightforward. What they did was to say it would be easier to be able to have, sorry, the slides are a little funky, but let the worker use both hands to stabilize the mask and take the activation of the bag down to the foot. And so somebody who's inexperienced with masking can hold a nice seal. The other thing that they put in is a suction that's attached to this same foot pedal. So you can do both suction and ventilation with the system. And this has been well developed, came out of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and is now proliferating. It's being used in India in a number of settings. So nice project, Gates funding primarily, and now it's being picked up. The little name in the left lower corner is a new venture fund in India that's supporting the development of this company, and this technology is going to make it out. So just another example of needs-driven innovation. And I think it's time to wrap, but Dennis, do you want to take questions? Let us know.
Yeah, we'll take a couple questions. For those who, we still have a great audience out here. Great to see everybody still here hanging on.
Mostly awake, yeah.
Mostly awake.
But
okay.
Eager to get out of here, obviously.
Yes.
Just curious, the women that it's been tried on, have they had epidurals, or how comfortable is this device in a non-anesthetized woman?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's our desire to not marry ourselves to epidural. There's some dogmatic and political viewpoints toward epidural in the future. But so far, we've only enrolled first-time women that have chosen to use an epidural for our clinical study. At Baylor, the epidural rate is over 80%, so it's already most patients anyway. However, we've had a couple patients where they had really poor epidurals, like they were in pain every time they had a contraction. And in those patients, they said that they felt our device. They said it felt like a speculum that was constantly being opened, which is, I suppose, what it should feel like. But they said it wasn't necessarily painful. It wasn't pleasant, but it was tolerable. And so we feel like that there could be other things that we do to also mitigate pain in patients that are non-epidural patients. We've also learned, as I mentioned, the stretching is sort of cumulative. So if you stretch for 5-10 minutes and you remove the device, when you go back, you sort of pick up where you left off. So that could be another mitigation technique for non-epidural patients in the future. Yeah. And so we've thought about a few other additions to the device too. There's already a lot of different variables that we could adjust. And so that's on the list.
It was that speculum association.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the blades, the sort of arms of our device are covered in silicone. So we've heard that just by doing that alone, that patients sort of appreciate it much more than a speculum already. Yes.
So I was fascinated by the way you've gone about determining what the priorities or opportunities might be. So as you expand beyond your local geography to a global context, how are you going to do this systematically? Is it going to be just people fortuitously coming across a need, or is there a process of systematically engaging with people doing global build?
Well, we very much believe that it has to be a systematic process, and that's why we've set up partner programs in India and Southeast Asia to train people in the process, and we have close to 1,000 people that we've trained already in those centers. So we do think that this process of really going out systematically, it doesn't have to be 2 months, but spend at least several weeks in observation and then filtering. That's a really robust process and needs to be done in the global setting as well as here.
Yeah, final question, please.
Yeah, I don't know whether everybody heard that, but 2 great suggestions. One is just to democratize the need identification, because healthcare workers understand what their problems are. And the second is to create kind of a registry of problems and offer that to people to solve. There are a couple of efforts that are up and running in that vein, and for reasons that aren't completely clear, there hasn't been huge traction with those, and it may just need the right effort to get it going. But great suggestions. I don't know if you have anything to add, James, to that.
No, I think we've thought about it. I think I think one of the hard parts is that our process leads you to say no to 99% of things. We recently had a guy from Google X, or as it's called X now, come and talk at our class, and he runs a rapid eval, and he said, my baseline assumption is that 99% of ideas are nonsense, and I have to figure that out really quickly. So you have to be sensitive to you want to give feedback to people when they show you a problem, but you also want to stick to a process, and we sometimes find it hard on such a very small interaction to make that feel right, because we typically say no to a lot of stuff, and that's been hard to navigate in my experience. I don't know what.
Also, the problem is maybe just the start of identifying the need fully.
Right.
And so you probably need to dive in a little deeper to truly understand the need. And so that initial problem, you're filtering kind of potential needs, I guess, at that point.
And we are great believers, James mentioned this, in fresh eyes, asking questions that are different from those of us who work in the trenches all day long. So there's something good about having a naive point of view coming in and looking at a problem.
Yeah, very good. I think some way of figuring out the right formula of crowdsourcing
Yeah.
needs-driven innovation and filtering through to the right kinds of needs. This is exactly the kind of thing this conference is about, and the structure around the programming for needs-driven innovation is exactly what we need to be doing in pediatrics and pediatric innovation. So thank you so much for your time. I don't want to I need to kick you off the stage.
Yeah.
And bring Chris up to close out the day. Just a round of applause for the group.
Thank you.